This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
I'm Tom Hoppe, and I'm your host of the Most Painful Podcast. Welcome to the Most Painful Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Hoppe. On our last episode, we spoke about chronic pain in children with Dr. Katie Bernier from the University of Calgary. And she spoke to us about the challenges parents face when their child is struggling with chronic pain. And she also spoke about SKIP, an organization which has excellent resources that could help parents and their children manage chronic pain. So if you missed this episode, you can listen to it on our Spotify or Apple feed. And actually, if you want to get notifications of the most recent episodes, then subscribe to the podcast. And that way you'll be up to date with everything that's being released. In Season 3, we spoke to Neil Pearson about yoga and chronic pain and how yoga can help manage pain. What about trauma-informed yoga, and how can it help people who are struggling with emotional stress? Today, I'm joined by Lori Taylor, a trauma-informed yoga teacher and also a fitness teacher, and she practices in Nova Scotia. Lori, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Nice to have you on the show. Maybe you can just start us off with a little background of how you got into trauma-informed yoga, and then we can talk about what it is and how it can help people.
Yeah, so it's probably like 28 years ago I started my journey into the fitness and wellness industry, and it was probably primary, more fitness-based than anything. And after several years, doing all of the physical based things like boot camp and spinning and those, high intensity training, athletic trainings, I found that, my clients and I were both, finding a bit of a gap between physical and mental and emotional. And it seemed like there was something missing in just the physical only. And so at that time, I met a Canadian military veteran who had post-traumatic stress and has post-traumatic stress. And he had asked me if we could look at yoga. His psychologist had been asking him for years to do yoga, maybe invite yoga into his journey. And so I had just taken a yoga class for the first time. And so I agreed. I'm like, okay, together we will look at yoga. And we started this journey of yoga and learning what yoga meant in the trauma-informed lens. And so for the last 8 years, we've been training together weekly and learning together that there is quite a difference between yoga in a yoga studio and trauma-informed yoga, and how crucial it can be in the journey of those that are suffering from things like post-traumatic stress, to have a concentrated lens on that aspect. There seems to be quite a need for the instructor or the teacher to have a knowledge and an understanding of what's happening in the client's brain and in their body from all the layers of self. Not just the physical, but the emotional and the spiritual. And so putting that all together makes it trauma-informed, understanding what that trauma is and where it comes from and what to do from here, and just navigating that together. It's a very individual journey, not a room of 30 people all together.
So, there's lots there to unpack. So maybe we can just kind of go back a little bit. So if someone asked you, or I'm going to ask you, you touched on a little bit, but what really is trauma-informed yoga? I know how you started the journey. And what are you really trying to achieve, and what kind of outcomes are you trying to achieve from it?
Well, I feel like the ability to learn how to not suffer is what we're trying to achieve in the trauma-informed yoga. That is also yoga. I think in North America, a lot of people are looking at yoga as a physical only, but the true sense of yoga is supposed to be the liberation and the freedom that one can attain from having a yoga practice. It is a lifestyle. And not so much the goal, but what you're working towards is more a freedom, a feeling of freedom and liberation and transcendence of suffering. And so with trauma-informed yoga, that is very key, the understanding of what the pain body is saying and finding the information from the pain, the transcendence of pain to no pain, to feelings like happy and free, which is quite different than just a regular yoga class.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about pain. Obviously, it's emotional pain. I would assume that's what you're speaking about.
Emotional pain, yes, but it shows up in the body.
Yeah,
and is
100.
stored in the body.
Yeah, and as we've heard on this show many times, is the connection between mind and body with chronic pain it's there, right? We know that connection.
Yeah.
So, just to clarify for our audience, what is the difference between that and regular yoga? What are you doing? So if I go to a Pilates class or I go to a yoga class, and what are you doing different than a regular, say, yoga class that someone would attend?
I feel like there's an attunement that is required from the instructor, the teacher, and the client. And that is really, really important to be able to attune to the energy that's happening inside of the client. And so that everything is done for the client only. It's nothing about the teacher. It's nothing about a process. It's nothing like, keeping to a script where a regular class might have a format. Trauma-informed yoga would not have a format. Everything would be client-led based on the attunement coming from the teacher, the instructor. Things are quite different. They are slower. There might not be a lot of physical posturing happening in the class. There might be more things like just breathing or doing other things than just the physical asana pose or posture of yoga. There's also, things that the instructor has to be attuned to, and that is on the level of triggers, which people have to learn, that people that don't understand about things like not moving around the class, not touching the client, being mindful of sounds, safety in the room, lighting, all of these things. If you go to a regular yoga class, generally they don't really care about those things, the door might be locked, things like that, which would be a pretty triggering moment, or it could be a triggering moment. And it's just a level of unawareness, from the teacher, the instructor. They just don't know what it feels like to not feel safe and to not be safe in their nervous system. And so there's a lot more attunement on the level of getting the nervous system to go from fight or flight to parasympathetic calm.
Yeah, and we can touch on that one well, actually, let's touch on that now. What's the difference between the two? and why it's important?
Yeah, I mean, fight or flight is a part of your nervous system that, like, we need to get things done in our day, but it's also really important to have that switch be able to come off. And so that we can come into our parasympathetic nervous system, which means that we're calm and we're feeling peaceful. And, it's oftentimes called rest and digest. So, um, the level of healing has to come from the parasympathetic side, not from the fight or flight. And so oftentimes I'll find clients, especially post traumatic stress, they're oftentimes in fight or flight, that side of their nervous system as opposed to parasympathetic. And so we really work hard on getting nervous systems to be attuned to the rest and digest side, where we can be open to healing and coming into that feeling of calm.
And so how do you achieve that? I mean, is it through a process of mindfulness? Is it through a process of mindful movement? How are you moving that person from the fight or flight to more of a calm?
Yeah, I find that the transference from fight or flight to parasympathetic is very, very individual and what people feel comfortable with, because it's their own individual nervous system that has to, come into that feeling of calm. And so, it might be breath, it might be breath work. It might be something like emotional freedom technique, which is tapping. It might be, chanting. It might be singing. It might be, coming into poses where they're held for longer times, like more yin yoga based, where you really get into it. Yin is more about coming into the feminine energy of yourself, coming into that feeling of taking care of yourself, nurturing yourself. It also can be quite uncomfortable in that place, but it's that transference of the uncomfortable into the comfortable. And how you get there is incredibly personal to you.
So when you talk about comfortable and uncomfortable, you're obviously not talking about the position, but more the emotional state.
Yes.
So it sounds to me that this is very personal approach, individual approach for each person. So how are you as a yoga teacher setting that up for each individual? How are you approaching that process?
Well, for me, I do trauma. My trauma informed yoga is always one on one, so that it can be 100% personalized to the client. I really feel like there is just so much going on that it would be very difficult to have multiple people in one class. It would take a lot of attunement from the instructor to be able to attune to multiple people at one time. So for me, it really has to be personal and a private experience. It also lends that feeling of safety, so that anything that needs to come up in that session, it's just possible and more inviting for it to come up. And that means that, people feel safe enough to let go of anything that they might be holding on to. And that looks different for every person. It might be angry emotions that come up, and it might be very sad emotions that come up. So, it really, in my opinion, it takes a lot to get to that safe space. And it's very personal and individual. And for me to sit alongside of someone suffering, I would rather it just be that one person so that I can totally be just with their suffering.
Yeah, and that makes sense. So I guess through dialogue, or is it just kind of trust the process? How do you? Each person's different. So if I were to come to you, um, how would you start this with me? Is it through a questionnaire? Is it through what I did in the past, or where I'm today, or like how does that process begin?
Yeah, I mean, normally that process would begin with just us sitting together without talking, actually, to see if we could just sit and be together and tune into our energetic body and just see if we can, like, just be in silence and in stillness for a moment and what comes up from there. And I'm going to say that usually people are quite uncomfortable with stillness and silence, and a
Oh, for
lot
sure.
comes up from there.
I am too. I mean, that's why I do a podcast. I need to talk all the time. But
Right.
no, yeah, I get that. So that's one way, is just through the just sitting there till something comes up, I guess, and start from there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So when are you also, someone seeing a psychologist and that, is there a coordinated approach to the process, like between you and the psychologist, or is it really just between you and the individual?
I really like when there is a coordinated, like, teamwork between the whole team. I really love when there is a psychologist on board. Um, and that makes me feel very good. I do also have some training with Gabor Mate that gives me somewhere to go when these difficult emotions come up. And so I understand a little bit about, what kind of conversation you have verbally, um, that brings us into that curiosity of what those emotions are and what the story is trying to say, what the words are trying to say, what the pain is trying to say. So there's some navigation that somewhere for me to go when things are becoming uncomfortable for both of us. So, but I really like it the best when the client does have their own psychologist that they can unpack and do things and process things together in that therapeutic way as well.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's building a lot of trust in order
Yes.
to open up. And hence, I guess this is why it would be better to have it individually versus being in a yoga class with 10 other people that you don't even know about.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, I mean, as we're getting close to the end of the show here, is there like any takeaways that you could give people who are listening today that might maybe start them down this path or might be helpful for them?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just even knowing that there is a difference between a yoga class and a trauma informed yoga class. That's a really big one, because everybody always says do yoga, but that's a pretty broad statement, go do yoga. There's multiple different yoga styles. There's all kinds of different yoga classes, and it's going to be really individual what yoga you're going to even be open to. And so, just I really invite people to tune in to what makes them feel comfortable in the beginning, so that they can explore being uncomfortable, but, not to set themselves up to be uncomfortable in multiple ways right off the top. Find somebody that is trained to have a look at individual trauma and to be comfortable in that environment.
And I think, yeah, like anything on, starting uncomfortable and then working towards comfort, it's
Yes.
hard to do, but it does, from what you're saying, and I think from what we've had other guests on the show, it is helpful for somebody to go through that journey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you can sit with it and if you can sit with it with someone else, it just seems to make things better in some small way or in a big way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's really insightful. And for me, I mean, it gives a better understanding of what it is, what trauma-informed yoga is. So I appreciate your time on the show today, and thanks for being on the show.
I'm really excited, and thank you so much for having me, Tom.
Great. On the next show, we'll speak to Brian Ramsey. He's the Executive Director of the Canadian Football League Players Association, and he'll be talking about the programs that help with identity and chronic pain in CFL players. In our past episodes, we've talked about the similarities between athletes and military when it comes to identity and chronic pain. So hit the subscribe and like button. And for any feedback about the show or for more information on chronic pain, you can visit our website, veteranschronicpain.ca, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Chronic Pain COE and on Instagram at chronicpain_COE. Once again, Lori, thanks for being on the show. And to our audience, stay safe and keep the hope alive.
The Most Painful Podcast
is produced for the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence by Story Studio Network.